Go to bed, Argo. Bye now.
Thank you for coming out here tonight. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Fantastic. My name is Gideon Marcus. I am the Galactic Journey. That's me. Good memory. We're going to have a quiz next period, so be sure to take notes on everything that is said tonight. So what is the date today?
22nd.
What year? 1963. It is June 22nd, 1963, and we are here today to celebrate the fact that we've just finished the Mercury program, having sent 6 Americans into space. That's right. Let's give it up for American astronauts. So in a few minutes, I'm going to tell you all about it for those of you who might have forgotten, despite the avalanche of media coverage over the last couple of years. But to start us all off, we're going to have a suite of period hits from none other than the young traveler, Lorelei. Take it away.
You do a mic check.
Okay.
Yeah. Can you hear it?
Yep, we can hear it.
Give a scale so we can tell
All
your voice.
right. Testing.
We can hear you.
You guys can hear me? Okay. All right. So how's everybody doing tonight?
Yeah.
Doing good? All right. Well, I'm gonna start us off with a bit of a classic. This one was popularized by Peggy Lee on the Ed Sheeran show, and I think you might recognize it. Feel free to sing along if you know the words. Very dear to me. I got to sing it at my uncle's wedding, actually. And ironically enough, I got to sing it in Hawaii, and you may recognize it. It's from Elvis Presley's Blue Hawaii album. But Now, if the handsome man over there could bring me my case, this next song requires a small key change. So, this may be one very famous so far. It's by one of my favorite singers, Harry Belafonte. And it sort of goes after the Hawaii with the tropical theme in saying farewell to Jamaica.
first gig. Can you believe she's never done that before in front of people? I should just go home because I'm just going to embarrass myself. So, let me tell you something about me and why I'm here tonight. So, as I said, my name is Gideon Marcus and I'm with Galactic Journey. That's galacticjourney.org. In fact, every single one of you, how many of you got cell phones? Just a couple of you, right? Okay. Pull out your cell phones now. Pull them out. Pull out your cell phones. Pull them out. Now you can leave them on. Pull them out and go to galacticjourney.org. All one word. galacticjourney.org. So Galactic Journey is a very special place. It is a blog from 55 years ago, day by day, by a bunch of science fiction and science fans. So we cover the Mercury launches as they happen, we cover the Vostoks as they happen, we cover the movies as they come out, we cover Twilight Zone, episode by episode. We cover Stranger in a Strange Land and other books of the time. We cover the music, we cover the politics, we cover the debates when Kennedy fought Nixon. Thankfully, Kennedy won. I'm sure we won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. Right? Well, I don't know any better. I still live in 1963. So that's the point of this. I came a few months ago. How many people were there a few months ago when I last performed? A few people. Very good. And you came back. I'm surprised. Thank you for coming back. So last time I gave sort of a little summary of the space race to date. Today, I'm going to focus on a very specific part of the space program, one that you guys are probably fairly familiar with, but maybe don't know all there is about it. So put yourself in the shoes of someone living in October 1957, right? The song that Lorelei just played, that would be Gravity. That would be popular at the time, you know, rock and roll, Buddy Holly was still around. And space was something that you only had in science fiction books. Maybe science fiction movies or science fiction radio shows, right? Nobody had been up there, nobody knew what it was about. And all of a sudden, October 4th, 1957, the airwaves are shattered by the sound of beep, 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 beep. There's a new moon in the sky, a Russian moon. And a month later, not only is there a new Russian moon in the sky, but it's got a passenger on board, a dog named Laika. So the first orbiting creature was launched by the communists, the godless, heathen, commie pinkos. Now, obviously, I understand in the future the Cold War's over and Russia's our friend, right? Okay, good. All right, well, just try to put yourself in the past when Russia was our adversary. Try and think real hard. So, of course, this was a national security nightmare. If they could put a dog up there, they could put a bomb up there. If they could put a bomb up there, that meant every place in this country was at risk. And not only that, even if they didn't bomb us, there could be people up there in satellites looking down on us with their cameras and taking pictures of things we didn't want them to see. And God forbid if there was a way that somehow our pictures could get anywhere in the world. Thankfully, we stopped that menace. So President Eisenhower, remember him? We like Ike? President Eisenhower commissioned there to be a new agency called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Yeah. And their job was not just to match them with little balls and little dogs. Their job was to put a man up there. And I say a man because this is the 50s and we hadn't discovered that women are people too. If you read Galactic Journey, you'll notice that I spotlight that fact quite a bit. There were women back then. There were actually very important women in the space program. But none of them were invited to be in the first space program, which was called Mercury. Now, how did Mercury come about? So at the time, they had a couple of options for sending something to space, right? They had to build something from scratch. They had nothing in 1957. All they had was a space plane called the X-15. And the X-15 was pretty cool. Could go Mach 6 up to 100,000 miles, or no, up to 60 miles up. It was pretty cool. It's pretty cool. But it couldn't get into orbit. So they had to think of a clever way to get into orbit. One way they thought of doing it was taking rocket boosters and sticking it on this plane and hoping they could find someone crazy enough to fly this thing in orbit. Thankfully, this plan did not pass muster. The Air Force had a program called Man in Space Soonest. It was basically a cannonball. And the guy inside would have nothing to do except sit in the chair and hope that they landed back on Earth. They got rid of that one too minimalist. So the easiest space probe you can make that'll come back to Earth is a globe, right? It is air resistant in all directions. If you put the center of gravity in the right place, the round part forms a heat shield. It's a great idea. Problem is we didn't have any rockets good enough and powerful enough to launch a globe that could fit a person in it. So we compromised. You can see that little gray trash can in the back there. That's the Mercury probe. And it is basically 1/16 of a sphere. The bottom is round like a sphere. And the rest of it looks like a shuttlecock or something. And that's what they came up with. And it had one job. This job was to carry a person into space and back. It was very cramped. It was coach only. No in-flight movie. So the next question is, who do you get to fly this contraption? So NASA said, well, let's open it up. Let's get people who fly. Let's get people who are in submarines. People who've been to Antarctica. Antarctica was a brand new thing at the time. Let's get people from all walks of life, all kinds of scientists, civilians, military. Eisenhower said, no, we are not putting it out to hundreds of thousands of people, 2/3 of whom could be cranks. We're going to go to test pilots. Does anyone know what a test pilot is? Does anyone here a test pilot? To give you an idea what a test pilot is, so the pilot man, how many people are pilots here? Anybody fly a plane? Anybody? Wow, nobody? Thank you, it's got to be a couple. So one of the mantras among pilots is never fly anything that's an A series. Never fly anything that's still got paint on the rudder pedals. A test pilot has to take the paint off the rudder pedals. The test pilot has to fly the plane before it can get to the B, C, and D series. They wanted people who'd flown the hottest jets in the scariest of circumstances, because at the time, nobody knew what being in space was going to be like. There was no gravity, there was no air, there were psychological concerns. People thought if you went into space, even if you could breathe, even if you could survive, even if you could eat, people didn't know if you could eat. Could you go to the bathroom? What would happen to your pee in space? Inquiring minds want to know. I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens.
That's Yellow Jeopardy.
People didn't know. People thought that there would be this psychological associative disorder. You get into space and you wouldn't want to come back. David Bowie ended up writing a song about that. No joke. So they needed the toughest of tough people, and test pilots was a good core for it. And they solicited to thousands of people. They got a few hundred applicants. They narrowed it down to 60. They narrowed it down to 30. And finally, they narrowed it down to 7. These guys. So they all have a few traits in common, right? They kind of look like a cross-section of middle-class America. White America, of course. Right? They're in their mid-30s. They're all married with kids. They're all vaguely Protestant. More or less faithful to their wives. But they're different. They have differences. So for instance, all of the services were represented, all the ones that had flying people. So the Army's not in there, even though the papers called them the flying GIs. They weren't. So in alphabetical order, we've got Scott Carpenter. He's a Navy lieutenant, Navy lieutenant. And he's actually a native son of California, Garden Grove, and a philosophical guy, and I don't mind telling you, probably the hunkiest of the group. I mean, look at that shirt. I need that shirt. Right? Next over, we've got Gordo Cooper. Now, Gordo Cooper, by the way, these guys all look older than me. Right? I'm 44. These guys all kind of look older, except for Gordo. They all smoked, except for Gordo. Gordo had a lung capacity twice as much as everybody else because he didn't smoke. This is back before they had the little warnings on your cigarette cases. Who in here smokes? Don't do it. Is it 420 somewhere? Gordo Cooper was an Air Force captain and a very laconic guy, very laid back, Oaksy accent that belied the fact that he was really quite smart. We have Gus Grissom, Virgil, no one called him Virgil. Gus Grissom, also a captain in the Air Force. He had flown in Korea. Lots of combat missions, like 50 combat missions. John Glenn was a Marine, lieutenant colonel, highest rank, and easily the most charismatic of them all and the cleanest. He had conflicts with the other people because he was the clean guy. He'd been on television before. He was the only Marine. And he had served in World War II and Korea. Gives you an idea. This is a time when you could pull from people who had been in big fighting wars. You've got Deke Slayton. His real name is Donald. Also a captain in the Air Force and also a veteran. And had a cool down-to-earth sort of gravitas, which will be important later. Alan Shepard had the most flight time, but no combat experience. He was also in the Navy. And finally you had Wally Schirra. He's in the background. He was the jokester. And he came by as flying honestly. His dad was a stunt pilot. His mom was a wing walker. So, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. Now just looking at this bunch of guys, can you guess who'd be picked to go first? Without knowing, right? John Glenn, right? Obviously. Not Scott Carpenter. I mean, look at the guy. Anyway, I get carried away. So, but before they could fly, they had to have something to fly in. Now, they didn't have time to make a rocket, so what they did was they took rockets that they put bombs on and instead put a spaceship on. Totally safe. And we didn't, right. Well, a lot, actually. So, we had a couple of rockets at the time, right? We had one that was called the Atlas. And the Atlas was going to be our first intercontinental ballistic missile. An ICBM, which is not a frozen turd. This is something that could carry a nuclear bomb all the way from Topeka to Moscow. There's a problem. It didn't work. Not consistently. Unless you liked fireworks, you didn't want to be in the Atlas. So they said, okay, well, you know what? We're not ready to put a guy in orbit yet anyway. We'll do the Mercury on something smaller. It's called a Redstone. The Redstone was a short-range rocket. And you put a Mercury on it, it could go up into space, touch space, and come right back down. And at least we could say we've been there and have about 5 minutes of weightlessness. Give us some bragging rights. Maybe we beat the Russians into space. That was worth something, right? Because at the time, the Russians were creaming us. Every single headline was, they'd gotten to the moon, they'd gotten something else up. Okay, so we have to beat them. All right. So we commissioned both the Redstone and the Atlas, and we figure we'll launch Redstone missions, and hopefully the Atlas will be ready by the end. So we launched some Redstones. Boom. We launched some Atlases. Boom. But they're getting better as they go.
So by boom you mean they exploded?
Yes, they exploded. They didn't do well. They sent Monkey up. Now here's a question: does anyone know who sent the first person into space? Which country? Well, it depends how you define person, right? You know, there are people who are 3.5 feet tall and exceedingly hairy, and we don't discriminate against them. And one of those was the first in space, a chimpanzee named Amos. But yes, if you're talking people, we were not the first. The Soviets got the first guy in space, a guy named Yuri Gagarin, and he orbited the Earth, much to our chagrin. And we were extremely upset by that because we could have had a guy in space first, but instead we sent a chimp first. But of course, you know, fireworks exploding, I think we would prefer that the first American in space not have a one-way trip. Now, by the way, before they got into space, these guys had to go through some rigorous training. These guys had to get as close to being in space as possible before they got there. And by the way, this is why we got from 30 to 7. A lot of people washed out. So we're talking physical tests. They would squirt ice-cold water into your ears to see how that would happen. They'd test your pain threshold by electric shocking you. They would stick you in isolation chambers to see how long you could be there before you cracked. Fun test. One thing they did was called the vomit rocket. Vomit comet? Vomit comet. So that's where you take a plane and you fly this parabolic path. So for 30 seconds, while you're in the plane, it actually feels like you're floating. Is there anyone in this audience who's done that? He's my ringer. By the way, this is Chad Ensor. He has designed stuff that is on the International Space Station right now. He's also incredibly shy and hates it when people applaud. But these guys passed these tests. I couldn't pass these tests. I can't even go a night without sleeping. These guys passed. So the question is, it's April 1961, and a Soviet has orbited the Earth. And an American chimpanzee has gone up suborbitally. So now it's May 1961, and our first guy is ready. You know who they picked? They picked Alan Shepard. And they picked Alan Shepard probably for two reasons. One, he was the most alpha of these guys. He was a take-charge dude. And he also had the most experience. So they figured, well, we'll send him up first. I mean, it's a short flight, but all the things he's going to experience, everyone else is going to experience, just maybe longer, right? You've got the crushing acceleration as you go into space. 7 to 10 times your normal weight, pressing you down into the seat, making your eyes black out. You've got your moment of weightlessness. And then you come back, and you're a fireball coming back to Earth for 10 minutes, out of radio communication with the Earth because of the ionized gases around you. And the same crushing gravity as you come back. They selected Alan Shepard for that. They didn't know if it was going to be a one-way trip or not. But before he went up, he had to be ready to launch. So they locked him in his capsule, literally bolted him into his capsule. And he's sitting in his capsule, and they have no provisions for food or anything like that. It's a 15-minute flight. 15 minutes, you can do a lot in 15 minutes. Think of all the things you can do in 15 minutes. You're laughing. If you can do that in 15 minutes, you need to get better. Anyway, Alan Shepard is sitting in that capsule, ready to launch for his 15-minute mission, for which no preparations have been made for him to be in the capsule for any length of time. And he'd had several cups of coffee that morning. And he's lying in this capsule, and he's holding it, and he's holding it. And there comes a time when you can't hold it anymore. And he had not been told to bring a bottle on board, something that roadies all know. And so he asked for permission to wet the suit. And flight control said no. He could short something out. The suit could stop working. He could die. And he said, well, it's either that or you have to pull me out and scrub the launch and wait another day, and who knows, the Soviets may get another guy up. Okay, take a leak. So the first American in space went up with a wetback. So he went up into space for 15 minutes, and that 15 minutes catapulted him to days, weeks, and now ultimately decades of fame. Alan Shepard came back to Earth, safe and sound in the Atlantic Ocean, just 15 minutes later, just a couple hundred miles away from the Florida launch pad from which he took off. And he went to ticker tape parades. He was fêted around the country. He was given an award by Kennedy. It was a big deal. Summer. NASA never does anything once if it can do it twice. Right? Maybe it was a fluke. So they brought their next most experienced guy, Gus Grissom. Now, Gus Grissom had the advantage that he was super short. So he could fit in this thing. He's only 5'3". Tallest you could be was 5'11". That was Scott over there. Can you imagine being, I mean, this is, you are crammed into a can. There is no room for anything else but you. So Gus Grissom was set to go up in July. And it was an exact mirror image of Alan Shepard's flight. What could go wrong? Alan Shepard's capsule was called Freedom 7. Gus Grissom's capsule was called Liberty Bell 7. An obvious reference to the shape of his capsule. He went up, no problem. He came down, no problem. Well, one of the things they'd done to make his ship safer was there's a hatch at the top, right? That's how you got out. But they figured, well, what if the thing tipped over? What if the guy was injured? Let's put a hatch right on the side that could be easily taken out, and let's give it explosive bolts. So all the astronaut has to do is hit this thing. Now he has to hit it hard. It's not something you can do by accident. You have to hit it, and it'll pop out the side. So Gus Grissom lands in the water. The aircraft carrier is standing by. The helicopters are coming over him. The hatch flies out, and the capsule starts filling with water. This was not part of the plan. Gus Grissom falls out into the water, and he's swimming. But the problem is, one of the valves is open on his suit, and it's filling with water. And he's drowning. And his capsule is drowning. Helicopters try to save the capsule. Like you do. Eventually, they can't save the capsule. It's filled up with water. Luckily, they captured Gus in their little harness in time to save him before he drowned. Thankfully. So after that, Gus was under the scrutiny of NASA for having screwed the pooch, right? Even though, the maximum flying is any landing you can swim away from is a good one. Well, eventually he was exonerated because the fact is two things. One, it was really, you could not do this thing by accident. And what is the chance of someone with thousands of hours of test pilot expertise and also being small enough to not feel claustrophobic in this thing, panicking? He short, and it popped. And they took steps to make sure it didn't pop later. But because of that, there was always a little bit of a cloud hanging over Gus. For a little while, not for long. In later points, we'll see where Gus goes in the space program, and you'll see that Gus's trajectory was clearly not dampened by this. All right. So how are we doing, right? We got one Russian in space. We got 2 Americans in space. We're doing okay. We're winning, right?
And a monkey.
And a chimpanzee, sir. A chimpanzee.
They got a dog.
Early hop.
They got a dog who didn't come back, by the way.
I got it.
Millions of Russians going, Shane! Shane! August 1961, the Soviets decide to rub our face in it. They send up a guy named German Titov. And German Titov doesn't go in orbit for one orbit. He goes in orbit for 17. 24 hours, enough time for you go to sleep, you wake up, he's still up there. And he comes back down to Earth, he's a hero. And what do we got? Suborbital shots. It's crap. We didn't even know we could do it. Atlas keeps blowing up. We go through winter, a long, cold winter. Still don't have a guy up. John Glenn's flight. He's the guy who's picked. John Glenn, remember him? They pick him for the good flight. Surprise, surprise. John Glenn's waiting. Delay in December. Delay in January. Is this guy ever going to go up? Are the Soviets going to launch 2 people, 5 people? A circus? Khrushchev. His shoes. Who knows? February 1962. John Glenn is bolted in to Friendship 7. Now you got to understand how big a deal this is. Everybody in this room, if this were 1962 for real, you guys wouldn't be away from the TV set. This is a huge deal. And not only was it a huge deal because we didn't know if it was going to work. We didn't know if this was going to put us in the same league as the Russians. We had to build a worldwide tracking network just to keep constant radio contact with this guy, right? We can't just listen in Los Angeles or Florida because he's going to be over South Africa. So we had to build a base in Australia. We had to build a base in Zanzibar. That's in South Africa. Southern Africa, not South Africa, the country. And we had astronauts manning all of these places around the Earth. Thousands of people ultimately were involved in this. February, John Glenn goes up. And he goes into orbit. And it's a huge deal because this is the thing that now is long enough that you don't blink and forget it. He gets to be in the news long enough for there to be able to be a crawl in Times Square. One orbit. John Glenn notes there's something outside his capsule. There's these floating, glowing things outside his capsule, following his capsule. I don't know what they were. Do you know what they were? He didn't know what they were. Kind of scary. He flies over Australia. All the good people of Perth in Western Australia put on their lights. so he can see them as they goes by. He says hi to them as he flies overhead. Imagine how cool that would be. You turn on your lights and the astronaut says hi. 2 orbits. Everything's still fine. His ship is great. Beginning of the 3rd orbit, there's an alarm on the ground. His parachute bag has been deployed. Now the parachute bag is on the bottom of the spacecraft, right where his retro rockets are, the thing that will slow his ship down so he can make it back into the atmosphere. His parachute's been deployed. That means it's not going to work at the right time, which means he's going to crash into the Earth and die. Or the retro rockets are damaged, in which case he's never going to make it back to Earth at all, and America is going to lose the first person in space. So of course they tell John Glenn all about it, right? No. He doesn't need to know right now. Let's not worry the guy. He's got enough on his plate. So they're trying to figure out what to do. They have an hour before the guy's got to come back, and he could come back in a fireball. I mean, this is no joke. So they decide, okay, we don't know the parachute bags come off, but if it's loose, instead of jettisoning the retro rockets when he's going to come in, instead, let's just leave them on. It's not going to hurt anything, and it'll keep the parachute bag in place, so that when he gets low enough, the parachutes can deploy and he can come back safe. Let's try it. It's all we can do. So John Glenn's getting ready to re-enter, right? He's floating backwards, by the way. They don't fly forwards in space, they fly backwards. And he's getting ready to fire his retro rockets, and they say, John, just so you know, your check engine light is on. And like any mechanic will tell you, it's probably nothing, you can drive with it, it's fine. He's a little upset that they didn't tell him. But that's fine, we're too late to commit. He goes in, fires his retro rockets, they fire fine. He leaves them on. He's going butt first, pardon me. He's going butt first into the atmosphere, 7 Gs, his retro rocket bursting into flames, fireballs going past his window, and then there's radio silence. For 5 minutes, for all we know, this guy has burned up. And everyone is waiting by the phone. And then they see him from the carrier decks. There he is, 3 parachutes, he's coming home safe. And if you thought Alan Shepard got a warm welcome, John Glenn was a hero. He had single-handedly saved the American space program. John Glenn. You can burst into applause if you like. It's pretty cool. All right. That's the end, right? Well, again, they were saying, we're pretty much done, right? Well, we still had a spacecraft. We still had rockets. We still had people. We'd only used 3 of them. Let's use all 7. So a few months later, they send up Scott Carpenter in May. Scott Carpenter's mission is going to be an exact duplicate of John Glenn's, right? Because do everything twice just to show you did it right. Scott Carpenter goes into space. 1 orbit, just fine. 2nd orbit, just fine. 3rd orbit, he's out of gas. How did that happen? He's out of gas for a couple of reasons. One, he was pretty happy to be up there. And he was so excited to be up there that a lot of his time he spent, taking pictures, making references, basically, being a good scientist in space. And the other was his thruster was broken and leaking, and he had to keep steering the ship to keep it straight. So by the time he was going to hit the thruster to go back, he had no gas. He came back on fumes. And not only that, but he hit the button a half second late. Half second, no big deal, right? He overflew his target by 250 miles. Nobody knew if the guy had made it back. They spent hours looking for the guy. Right? He's in the Atlantic Ocean somewhere floating. They find him. He's sitting on his raft. He offers the guys food. He's a chill guy. Now, he was a guy who got blackballed. Scott Carpenter, for his failing to fly a perfect flight, basically was never allowed to fly again. And it was kind of a personal vendetta and not really fair. And one of the sad stories, although he went on to, by 1964, a little foreshadowing, become one of the first aquanauts, one of the first people to live under the sea. So, He found his own. He wrote a few science fiction stories. Cool guy. And great shirt. So now we're winning, right? We got 2 guys up. So the Soviets go, okay, we're going to launch 2 guys too. At the same time. Just rub your face in it. So the 2 guys, Nikolaev and Popovich. And they launch them in such a way that they get to fly right next to each other. They can't actually rendezvous in space. They don't have engines. But they can fly right next to each other. They can see each other. They can wave at each other. They can sing at each other, throw Porsche at the windows. Right? All right, well, we still have a space program. We still got to do what we got to do. It doesn't matter that they're winning. So we send up, by the way, Carpenter's ship was called Aurora 7. Wally Schirra, next guy up, his flight is Sigma 7. They're going to double Glenn's flight. 6 orbits. Not that big a deal. But the point of Schirra's flight is to show how perfect the flight can be. His flight was called Sigma 7. Sigma means the sum in engineering speak. And it was going to be the sum of all the Mercury flights. Basically, the flight to end all flights. And it was. 6 missions. If you guys had read the press kit for the mission, you honestly didn't need to watch the mission. He did it so perfectly and landed so close to the carriers. It was like a computer simulation. It was absolutely flawless, to the point where the newspapers didn't cover it. He was not front page news when he went up, because it was boring. His ship didn't burn up, he didn't get lost at sea, it was perfect. He was fine with it, though. He had no trouble with his flight being fine. All right, so how do you cap that? Well, 6 orbits is still only 9 hours in space. Mercury can do more than that if you beef it up a little bit. Take out some of the unnecessary stuff, put in some extra air, put in some batteries. You could put a guy in space for a day. And maybe Popovich was up there 5 days. Okay, but a day at least is a day. We can say 5 days a day, it's a day at the end of the number. It's still good enough. So they picked Gordo Cooper for that flight. Why not Deke Slayton? They grounded Deke Slayton. Deke Slayton had a heart murmur. They hadn't caught when he was first going through tests. So they grounded Deke. Don't worry, his story has a happy ending, but I won't cover it tonight. But he's off the flight line, so the only guy left is Gordo Cooper. And Gordo Cooper was an interesting guy. He was a little bit maligned in the Space Corps because he was so laconic, because he was so spare with his words, because he sounded like an Okie. And people have prejudice against Okies, which is dumb. But they did. The guy was smart, though. He was also cool as a cucumber. All right, so he's going to fly in March. No. He's going to fly in April. No. May 14th, they put him into his capsule. He's ready to go. There's a tracking station in Bermuda that's offline, and they pull him out. Now, I want to pause here. We've talked about these 7 guys and how important they are. We've talked about a few Russians and how important they are. We've talked about a dog and a chimp. But the fact that a tracking station in Bermuda could go down and the entire thing goes out tells you how important the thousands of people who were at the base of this pyramid. These guys are at the tip. The people who made the spacecraft, the people who maintain the spacecraft, the ground control, the flight control, the families of these people who supported them during these crises. They're the important ones too. Don't forget them. So Gordo Cooper, May 14th, he didn't get to fly. May 24th, May 14th. May 15th, he gets in his capsule, and they go through the pre-flight checks, and they listen to his microphone, and this is what they hear. Gordo, huh? Time to fly. Okay. This is a time when the other astronauts, their hearts were racing 200 beats a minute. Gordo Cooper falls asleep. My wife can attest that this can truly happen. Not at that situation. So Gordo's asleep. They wake him up, and he flies into space. He's going to fly for 22 orbits. That's a long time. That's a day and a half. They give him outs. You can bug out at the 7th orbit. You can bug out at the 17th orbit. No, I'm fine. No, I'm fine. He's the first American to take a nap in space. It was planned. He slept for about 6 hours, and he woke up and he spoke a prayer, and he asked God to bless not just him, but the thousands of people who helped him get there. Then in the 19th orbit, things started to go a little south. So his instruments started to go out, one by one. So he didn't know which direction he was flying. Then his autopilot went out altogether. And this is the one moment when you're glad you put a test pilot in your spacecraft instead of a monkey. Because as a matter of fact, we needed a person with the hair trigger reflexes and the thousands of hours of flight time and the hundreds of hours of knowledge of his capsule. He's sitting in his capsule without any computer aid. He has to do the orbital calculations by himself. He has to know exactly when to push that retro rocket button. Or he may not just end up like Scott Carpenter 250 miles away in the Pacific. They're in the Pacific now. He might not come back at all. He may point the wrong direction and skip up. He could just burn in the atmosphere and too shallow a dive. It's all in his timing when he pushes this button. So he pushes it. And when he lands even closer to his carrier than Schirra did in his textbook flight. He came down so close that the frogmen who were there to pick him up, we thought he was going to come down right on top of us. And by the way, one of the coolest things, I've written articles about all of these, and I wrote an article about Gordo Cooper a month ago when it happened. And I got a comment on this article from one of the frogmen who picked him up. It's one of the coolest things about my job is getting to meet these people, even all these years later. Check it out, it's super cool. He talks about his experience. So, is that the end of the Mercury program? Well, Alan Shepard says, no! I only got to fly for 15 minutes, and my ship didn't sink. Right? My ship don't sink. So he says, we don't have to stay for a day. We can do 3 days in the Mercury. Come on. No, we're not going to do it. Come on. He and the astronauts go to Jack Kennedy, the president. They go to the White House and they say, come on. Jack Kennedy calls up Jim Webb, the head of the NASA, and says, what do you got? Who's running the show down there? True words. Who's running the show down there? So, in the end, Mercury 10 is canceled. And Gordo Cooper is the last guy to go up. His ship was called Faith 7. This choice of name did not go over well with NASA, as you might guess, because they were worried about the headlines, America loses faith. And it was because of that and an incident later on that they stopped letting people name space probes altogether for a while. All right, so it's May 1962. We've won, right? This is the end. It's a good capper to the space program. We don't need to go anymore. And I'm going to leave things, Janice says never do this, I'm going to leave things on a bit of a somber note. Because unfortunately, I was originally scheduled to do this talk in late May. And I was going to end it on a triumphant note. USA, USA, we got faith. A week ago, the Soviets launched a second dual shot. Big deal. Comrade Bykovsky's in space for 5 days. They've already done that. Vostok 6 goes and rendezvous with it. Big deal, they already did that. The person who was piloting Vostok 6 was Valentina Tereshkova, a woman. And not only was she a woman, but almost as important, and something that is missed, is she was a civilian. In other words, the Soviets weren't planning on going into space just for stunts or for military reasons. They were going up there to stay. They wanted to know how space was going to affect men and women, military and civilians, because eventually they were going to put hundreds of people, thousands of people, and create a communist utopia in space, which is, why, of course, there are red hotels on the moon right now. So, as of late June, it looks like the Soviets are still winning, and they've stuck our face in it again. But I'll tell you this. In 1961, a great man said, "We commit to put a man on the moon and bring him back before the decade is out." Right? Not because it is easy, but because it is hard. You can do Jack all day. And in fact, in 1963, Apollo is well on its way. The moon program is well on its way to being done. And there's even a bridge space program called Gemini that's going to be a two-person craft. And it's not going to take two spacecraft to put people in orbit. We'll do it in one. And God willing, we're going to get Gemini up before the Soviets figure out how to put two people in a space capsule. Thank you very much.
We lost you.
I'm out. We're all going to be looking through telescopes after this. The good people from OPT have brought their 20-inch over. It's cloudy, but there's a remote hookup from Joshua. So if it turns out we can't watch from here, we can at least see it, on television, just like we all watch the Mercury probe. Thanks very much again.
Did you like it?